the clinic undertook its first collaborative projects with the students at the Faculty of Law, Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia. In the first project, students from UKM and the UNSW Human Rights Clinic produced a report to assist Malaysian NGOs to identify opportunities for policy and legislative reform regarding Malaysia's implementation of its obligations as a migrant worker receiving country. In the second project, students from UKM and the UNSW Human Rights Clinic produced a report for the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, which identifies a model regional framework specifically in relation to the guardianship of unaccompanied minor asylum seekers. In order to critically assess the benefits and challenges of the transnational collaborative clinical project as a student learning experience, the perspectives of the students are key. The perspectives presented in this video are those of the clinic students involved from the UNSW Human Rights Clinic. In particular, I asked the students to reflect on the collaborative models used, the key learning opportunities and challenges for them, and what changes could be made to the current model to maximise its impact as a part of the UNSW Human Rights Clinic program. Students were also invited to make any other comments they wanted to about the experience. Here's what they had to say.
We were allocated separate research tasks from the very beginning, with the ultimate goal being to combine our research and to produce a cohesive set of recommendations. So our report was looking at best practices, while our UKM partners were looking at the domestic legal framework that exists in Malaysia in relation to these migrant workers. At that initial stage, we largely worked independently, and the interaction that we had with our partners was pretty much limited to exchanging introductions and I suppose discussing the referencing style and a little bit of the conceptual focus that our report would take. After that, we exchanged our reports with each other, and then we attempted to integrate the two reports and sort of synthesize the content and make the whole thing appear a lot more cohesive and more clearly connected to the specific question that we'd been asked to discuss, namely legal redress mechanisms in relation to these migrant workers. And we continue to be responsible for different parts of the report.
Each group separately completed background research focused on the international human rights of unaccompanied minor asylum seekers and the current legislative and policy framework for guardianship of unaccompanied minors in our respective regions. So Max and I researched Australia, and our counterparts at UKM researched Malaysia and another ASEAN country. Later, we then undertook more focused research on Australia's compliance with international human rights law, and our counterparts did the same. We also researched best practice examples in the EU.
And the next stage of the report involves synthesising our research findings into a set of recommendations and coming up with a best practice model that we thought was most suited to Australia and ASEAN nations. And we plan to recommend this report to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights.
We found that the division of labour initially worked really, really well, because it would have been quite unrealistic to expect us to collaborate on every single point in the beginning of the project. So it worked really well coming together after about a month of independent research.
We thought that appropriate expectations were set in relation to how much collaboration we were meant to be doing with each other. It might have been a bit unrealistic to expect us to be always working as a team across international borders. So we thought that there was a right sort of balance was struck between the two.
Owing to time differences and scheduling challenges, our most common method of contact was email. Contact via email was regular, so it occurred at least every week. We conducted a Skype meeting after we completed our initial research as well, and this was an important milestone in the project timeline as we were about to begin drafting our report. The Skype meeting allowed us to build a stronger relationship with our partners and talk through our key concepts for the report. We were also able to iron out differences in our approach and interpretation to the milestones that were set by our supervisors. We used a Google document when collating our report and also in the final review stages, and this allowed both groups to work on the same document.
Our main method of communication was via email. We always did a group email where everyone was included and was always given the opportunity to participate and really be informed about what was going on at every stage. We chose that over having like a point person from each university because it just made it far more inclusive and really a cooperative effort. The other method of communication that we used was a Skype call. It was actually about 3 hours because we had some technical difficulties with the internet, but it was a really great opportunity to actually get to know the Malaysian students and have that face-to-face contact and bond a little bit and have a bit of a laugh as well. The last way that we communicated and kind of worked on the document was through a Google document, and that just meant that we could work on it all at the same time. We could make changes, and it completely kind of bridged that geographical divide and made it a really efficient process rather than having two separate documents and getting confused on where we're up to and then constantly adding in bits and things like that. So yeah, it worked really well.
Thanks, Nicole. Can you just describe how the Google document works?
An amazing system which basically it's all stored online and multiple authors can access it at the same time, which meant that we could be editing the document at the same time that our Malaysian partners were editing the document. It was all saved automatically and a lot, like Nicole mentioned, a lot better than having two Microsoft Word documents and merging those together, which have just been a logistical nightmare. Yeah.
So the time difference and different class times of the Malaysian students to ours was what really impeded communication. Obviously, it would have been much easier had we been operating under the same schedule in terms of being able to communicate regularly. Also, the Malaysian team were allocated less class time, which meant that Marianne and I actually moved quickly through the report where the Malaysian team had less time and we were often at different stages of the report and had to sometimes wait to hear back from them as to where they were in the report stage.
Another key challenge in drafting the report was creating something that would be politically digestible and relevant to our intended audience, which was the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. At times, Max and I felt somewhat uncomfortable with our role as contributors to the report. We felt uneasy about addressing a report to this ASEAN human rights body, which included criticisms of Australians' guardianship arrangements, but ultimately sought to make recommendations for reform in Southeast Asia. Given Australia is not a best practice model for guardianship of UMass, the relevance of the Australian framework to our audience was one concern. We're also concerned that our contributions might be perceived as imposing our own values that are informed by our own national context.
There were a few language barriers. So one idea which Nicole proposed that we discussed in our report was this idea of decriminalisation of migration, but this wasn't a concept that was readily identifiable or recognised by our partners, so we did have to spend some time, I suppose, discussing and explaining what we meant by that. And the final thing, and probably the most difficult challenge that we had, was coming from different philosophical orientations and educational backgrounds as students. So we're both development studies majors and we've done human rights subjects at university, which means that we've been trained in a school of thought which teaches us to be quite critical and constantly challenge the material that's presented to us in terms of human rights abuses and generally social injustice around the world. However, we found that our partners came from mainly a legal background and as law students, which meant that they approached the report with a more technical and legalistic, I suppose, interpretation. And also they were a lot more diplomatic and balanced than we were. We were immediately critical of the situation, and we found that we learned a lot from how they presented it in terms of the political sensitivity surrounding the topic. So we had to learn to, I suppose, bridge that differences and bridge that gap between backgrounds that we came from.
In terms of overcoming these challenges that we've just identified, we realised that pragmatism really was the key because we were working to a strict timeline in terms of when the report needed to be finalised by. So we just basically continued to work to the schedule whilst not necessarily knowing all the time whereabouts our counterparts in Malaysia were in terms of their schedule. But when we did finally reach a point when we really needed an update and a comprehensive one on where our counterparts were, we contacted them and suggested that we have a Skype meeting in order that we could get across where each team was and what we needed to do in terms of going forward on the report.
Yeah, and at this Skype meeting, we also discussed our differing capacities. So the fact that Max and I had 16 dedicated hours a week to work on the project, and that our counterparts were working on this project in their own time alongside other work and study commitments. So we took account of that and tried to divide the work equally to in line with the time resources that we had as a group. In the final stages of preparing the report, it was also decided that we should jointly submit the report to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and an Australian organisation. We decided that our Australian audience should be the National Children's Commissioner in Australia, and reshaping our original mandate for the report brought some great relief. Our role as Australian students contributing to the report became more meaningful, and our philosophical concerns about how our contributions might be perceived by our audience were largely addressed.
So I think there were a few things that we both took away from the entire project. One was in terms of working transnationally, particularly relying upon the internet as our sole means of communication. We also learned about how to be diplomatic when raising concerns or presenting feedback to our partners. This is particularly the case because English was not the native language for our partners over there, and so there might have been a risk of misinterpretation at times, which we had to be both quite wary of. And the final thing was political sensitivity. So migrant domestic workers are such a controversial topic in Malaysia, and our project was also going on at the same time that elections were happening, so we had to be sort of cognizant of this broader political and social context within which we were working and within which our partners were working as well.
One of the biggest things I think that we learned and took away from it was just patience. Working transnationally takes a lot longer than just face-to-face communication, and you can't resolve issues straight away. It's just when the other people get back to you and when, it is a longer process. I think that another thing that was really good that we took away from it was just showing that if you're just open and honest, it really does work in your favour. During, as Amritha mentioned, it was election time in Malaysia, and they were just really honest about it. They were saying, we have to go home and work in the elections, and so they took a while off the project, and then when they came back, it just meant that we could work on something else while they were home for the elections. I think also we always had a really good rapport, all of the students. We were really, really friendly, and just whatever it was, we just had really open communication, and whenever something wasn't clear, we just clarified it pretty much, and that constant questioning and clarification really did make the work to a higher calibre as well, I think, just because you have a much clearer picture for everyone else as well as yourselves ultimately.
So we definitely both learnt that the key to a collaborative project like this, especially one that it happens transnationally, is regular and comprehensive communication. In any future collaborative project like this, I definitely will emphasise the need for such communication to take place at the beginning of the report, and then identify key timeline goals in terms of when both teams should really come together and talk about where they are and what's going wrong and what needs to happen for the project to move forward.
And I also learnt that collaboration is not necessarily about equal time contributions. There's no way to quantify the benefit of local knowledge or the benefit that can come from bringing different people together with ideas about international human rights law. So rather, collaboration is maximising the use of all available resources. I believe that a transnational project can be a really exciting avenue for research groups to demonstrate international concern for human rights issues, to pool resources, and to incorporate a range of cultural perspectives on issues that demand international and domestic policy attention. It's been a great experience in learning to work with people from different cultures and across international borders. I've gained techniques in how to work with others, and that includes building on the strengths of others.
And just to add to what Marianne just said, the ability for each team to bring unique knowledge that they have of their own national context to an international project like this really added value. I don't think that the report would be as robust and comprehensive if it wasn't informed by localised knowledge known by each team.
We would maybe recommend having maybe a monthly Skype meeting, just to kind of foster that connection between the partners, and also just to kind of check in and make sure that everything's working really well. Also maybe a bi-weekly email kind of update on status rather than just questions and things like that of where you're up to and how everything's going, just to kind of enhance the
collaboration, I suppose.
Yeah.
So a transnational project is likely to be most effective, in my opinion, where each country group has a really meaningful role and where value is added by the specialist knowledge of each country group. And one way to achieve this, I think, which we've managed to do, is to jointly submit the report to bodies in each region for where the contributing parties are from.
Yeah, and I think that could really be aided by more regular communication via Skype, again, occurring at the beginning, and allowing for some more personal relationships to be formed between the teams, and just a free-flow exchange of ideas on things that we think should be included in the final report.
Well, we both think it's been such a great opportunity, and we think it would be a fantastic idea to replicate this sort of model of international collaboration between students and universities in other subjects and other aspects of university life.
Yeah, and we just got to learn so much about communicating transnationally and across cultures and things like that we never really would have had in a classroom, and amazing training. So it was a really incredible program.
While we've identified some issues associated with collaborating transnationally, it was a really amazing experience, because it taught us a lot of skills that we wouldn't ordinarily get just doing teamwork on campus, in obviously with classmates that we're with all the time. Learning to communicate cross-culturally and transnationally via different modes of communication and at different times, managing the obstacles that were thrown in our face was really beneficial.
Yeah, and I think the project has really presented these great and unique opportunities, and they're unlike any that I've encountered in uni so far. And the challenges presented by the project, while they were significant, in my opinion, that's what's made it such a great learning experience. And we've produced a report now that we're really proud of, and that was only made possible through a transnational project where we've had great guidance from each of our respective coordinators in our regions.
I would second that.